The 17th chapter of Isaiah is about the burden of Damascus. And we're going to read the first half and look at that today. And the second half is a addition to that, but it's more general nature of staying close to God and believing Him and doing what He says, which we'll look at in our next session. But I will read the first 8 verses, as is our custom, and then go over them individually. The burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. They shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. And the fortress shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdoms from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith Jehovah of hosts. And it shall come to pass in that day that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. And it shall be as when the harvestman gathereth the standing grain, and his arm reapeth the ears. Yea, it shall be as when one gleaneth ears in the valley of Rephaim. Yet there shall be left gleanings therein, and the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 berries at the top of the uppermost bough, 4 or 5 in the outmost branches of a fruitful tree, saith Jehovah, the God of Israel. In that day shall men look to their Maker, and their eyes shall have respect on the Holy One of Israel. And they shall not look to the altars, the work of their hands, neither shall they have respect to that which their fingers have made, either the Asherim or the sun images. So this is the burden of Damascus. Now we've looked at the burden of the Philistines, the burden of Assyria, and this is an important one too, and I'm going to discuss at some length the relevance today of this, as many of the so-called prophecy buffs are looking at the war that's been going on since, I think, 2011 in Syria as a fulfillment of this prophecy. Verses 1 to 3 read, The burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. They shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. And the fortress shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith Jehovah of hosts. Now this again is given as a burden, which is the Hebrew word is masa there. And it's like this heavy set of declarations. In Hebrew, this word masa is only given with some real stern warning of something big that's impending coming from God. It's not a admonition. You shouldn't have done that. It's a whole lot stronger than that, and it's indicative of judgment that's coming as a result, not forgiveness, at least not in the short term. There's a Jewish Targum that I read, a bunch of them actually. They're just Jewish writings that they look at this as the burden of the cup of cursing to give Damascus to drink. In other words, here's this cup filled with these cursings, and here you go, Damascus, drink this, and you are going to drink it. The city got these declarations about 735 BC. Now, Isaiah started prophesying, about 9 years before then, so he's getting a lot of information shortly after he started prophesying. And at the time he wrote this, Damascus in Syria, and there are people that think that's the oldest city in existence in the world, had aligned with the northern 10 tribes, and they were going to come against Judah in the south. And we looked at that, and I'll reference it again in a few minutes, but we looked at that back in chapter 7. Syria, interestingly, in the Bible is called Aram. Aram, that's the ancient name of Syria. It wasn't called Assyria, which was a different group that was founded later, but it was called Aram. And because Assyria had threatened the southern kingdom, God was speaking through this prophet Isaiah, telling him, look, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. If you believe me and you trust me, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff, because they're not going to harm you. And Assyria never did, and neither did Syria or their alliance with the northern 10 tribes. They never did harm the south. They tried on numerous occasions. The conquering was done of the north on 732 BC, and it was explained in 2 Kings 16:9. It was in ruins, completely in ruins, by Tiglath-Pileser III, and what he had done was destroy the city in 732 BC. It would be rebuilt because the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar were going to do it again as described in Jeremiah 49:21. So the prophecy has been fulfilled. Damascus has been destroyed 2 times, and it was total destruction too. Again, I have to emphasize that it was total destruction. It's important to see, though, how the northern king of Israel, the kingdom of Israel in the north, those 10 tribes, it's usually referenced by Ephraim. I think I put in the capital. Samaria was the capital in your notes there. It's really the largest population group, Ephraim, one of the tribes in the north, so they would just call it Ephraim. And that was where Jeroboam the first came from too. So, it's a reference to the whole 10 tribes in the north. There was a king of Syria called Rezin, and the northern king of Israel was a guy named Pekah. Now, we've looked at this in the past, but it's helpful to review it. Both of them were usurpers. When the Bible talks about Pekah, the second to the last king up in the north there, he calls it Remaliah's son. And that's a slur, because Remaliah was not the king before him. He was a usurper too. And he got his son in as the king. So they're trying to show that it wasn't a normal succession. He was a usurper. In other words, these guys were not very good. They were illegal usurpers, and they didn't like the idea of Judah being strong, so they wanted to war against the southern kingdom, and they wanted to get rid of Ahaz. Ahaz was weak to begin with, and they wanted to put a puppet king in there so they could control the south. And in the south, realizing what was taking place, they got really concerned, and they said, well, maybe we ought to go get some help. Instead of leaning on God, they go to the Assyrians and look for help. And it produced a set of circumstances that Ahaz did not expect, because he eventually had to just surrender to their domination. He had to do whatever they said. He became a puppet to them. They knew they were to trust God. They knew that God had promised them peace, security if they trust him, and they didn't do it. Now, This Israel, northern Israel, and Aram, or Syria, if you will, alliance just terrified Ahaz. I have to say that Ephraim is the term, again, that's used to reference the whole of the north. And in grammar, that's called a figure of speech. A figure of speech. And it means one thing references the whole. So if somebody was talking about the whole United States, they would say, Washington's going to do this. And they would be referencing the entire country. Well, it's the same thing here. It's a synecdoche. So Ahaz thinks he can marry up with the Assyrians and everything will be fine. But what he doesn't realize is they're going to take over him too. So they do go up and they conquer the north. They conquer Assyria. They conquer Syria, and they destroy Damascus. Then they come down to the northern tribe of Israel, and they conquer there too in 722. And look at the text in 2 Kings 17:24 says, "And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and Sepharim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria," which is the capital of the north, "instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof." Well, this is the beginnings of the Samaritans, if you will, the half-breeds that the Jews hated by the time Jesus came. There's a lot of biblical references to the negative aspects of Israel's relationship with Syria, Aram. And I'm just going to touch on some of these here. Damascus has become helpless. Jeremiah 49:24. "The king of Assyria took Damascus and exiled its inhabitants." Ahaz was so much in love and obedient to the Assyrians that he loved their altars, their worship places, and he copied one and brought it back to the temple in Jerusalem. And he even sacrificed to those gods. God says, "I'm going to set a fire to the wall of Damascus, and the spoil of Damascus and Samaria will be carried away to Assyria," which it happened. And then God is saying, "Is not Samaria like Damascus?" In other words, you guys in the northern tribes are just as bad as those pagans up there. The kingdom will disappear from Damascus, and that's from our present text. God says, "I will break the gate bar of Damascus, and for three transgressions of Damascus, and for 4. In other words, he's going to destroy them for what they've done. And finally, the oracle of the word of the Lord will rest on Damascus. They will have a final judgment in the Messianic kingdom. And I'll conclude with that information today about how God is going to deal with them in the Messianic kingdom, at the end of the tribulation, the beginning of the Messianic kingdom. They have had a perpetual hatred of Israel. Perpetual hatred of Israel. And starts out in Numbers 20, if you will. You can see some of the activities there. And in a summary form in Psalm 83, about all the Arab nations that have harbored hatred against Israel. And people today think that this civil war that's taking place over there is a fulfillment of this prophecy. There's nothing in the biblical text to validate that. And the way God describes the destruction of the Damascus in the Bible, it's total. And we're going to go over some agricultural issues to verify the totality of this and the carrying away of citizens, and how the very few at the top of the civilization there get to run away. It doesn't match up with this today. But a lot of people that just look at Bible prophecy and don't pay attention to the rest of the Bible have a tendency to overemphasize prophecies and see them as being fulfilled today. There's a statement that a good hermeneutics book will make, and that is, you look to the Bible and then current events to see fulfillment. You don't go the other way. You don't go see a current event and say, oh, that must be fulfillment here. Because the people that do that are only looking at part of the prophecies that were given. They're not looking at the whole thing. Today's events over there do not match up with the prophecies here. There's also another hermeneutical principle called double reference. And if a prophet gives a prophecy that is going to have an immediate fulfillment, it may also have a long-term fulfillment. And one of those is given where Moses says that a prophet is going to come after him. And that was Joshua in the near term. And then you can look to the book of Acts, chapter 3, where it talks about another fulfillment of this is the Lord Jesus. So the Bible validates this double reference, and they don't say anything about Damascus in modern times. There's just no biblical reference to it. Now, Psalm 83 is a imprecatory psalm, and it is written by a man named Asaph, and he's pleading with God to cause some destruction to these neighboring Arab states surrounding Israel. There's nothing in there about those nations all collectively attacking Israel, nor is there any certainty that God is going to do this. It's just Asaph begging God to do something. People have taken this psalm and twisted it around and saying, well, that's a fulfillment of this prophecy. No, it's not. It's Asaph asking God for something. It never says God's going to fulfill that in this manner. The text moves on about Israel is going to have to suffer. In Isaiah 17, verses 4 to 5 read, and it shall come to pass in that day that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. And it shall be as when the harvestman gathereth the standing grain, and his arm reapeth the ears. Yea, it shall be when as one gleaneth ears in the valley of Rephaim. Ephraim and Israel had power for several reasons. The volume of people that were there, the number of tribes that were there, and the number of cities and the citizens in those cities. But now God's saying, I'm going to thin you right out. I'm going to take away this prowess you have. The large numbers are going to be turned into prisoners of wars. And in saying that the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean, what he's saying is he's using an illustration of somebody that, for example, has a disease like dysentery, where they just keep shrinking right down to skin and bones. That's what you're going to be like. You're just going to become a skeleton. And the riches of his glory shall be carried away, is the paraphrase in the Jewish writings. The text moves to say that it shall be as when one gleaneth ears in the valley of Rephaim. The valley of Rephaim was near Jerusalem in ancient times, and it was noted as being a very infertile area. They couldn't grow much there. So what God is saying here is using that as an illustration. He said, first of all, there's not going to be much growing there in the first place. And then when the reapers come in, they always leave some for the gleaners. The gleaners were the people that were poor, and this was their welfare. They could go into the fields after the harvest. The reapers took the main harvest, and they left a little for the gleaners. And the gleaners, God's saying here, they're going to come in, there's not going to be hardly anything for them. And that's how he's using this illustration to say what I'm going to do to you guys. And that's just ancient welfare. It's kind of an interesting welfare system. They had to work for it. But it was there. If they wanted the food, they could get it. And it was available to them. They didn't just get it by being. They had to do something for it. So the text moves on. The last several verses say, "Yet there shall be left therein gleanings, as the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 berries in the top of the uppermost bough, 4 or 5 in the outermost branches of a fruitful tree, saith Jehovah, the God of Israel. In that day shall men look unto their Maker, and their eye shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel. And they shall not look to the altars, the work of their hands, neither shall they have respect to that which their fingers have made, either the Asherim or the sun images. Yet there shall be left therein gleanings." Now again, we're looking at a simile here, which is an implied reference to these northern 10 tribes, that few of them are going to escape. A remnant are going to escape. We're not talking about the valley of Rephaim here. We're just talking about general north. And he's talking about the smallness of their number to these grapes that are going to be gleaned after the harvest. The same thing is signified by another simile, the shaking of an olive tree to cause the ripe olives to drop, or the striking of a staff. So they would shake the olive trees, they would beat them with a stick to try and get them down, and beat them off, and then there are left 2 or 3 berries at the top that will not shake down. And what he's referencing there is the government officials and the magistrates that are going to be immune to this because they're smart enough to know what's going on. They're going to run away and hide. They're going to protect themselves. They're going to protect themselves. Therefore, 2 or 3 olives are left because they can't be reached by the hand of the gatherer or the staff of the striker, is also referencing Israel, Jerusalem. Israel's Jerusalem. Because the Assyrians could not get to Jerusalem and Hezekiah. Now we're going to go over that in a subsequent chapter in great detail, but it's a fascinating story. The Assyrians came up to Jerusalem, they threatened Hezekiah, and what did Hezekiah do? He turns to God. He didn't go to anybody else. He turned to God, and that caused their salvation and the destruction of the Assyrian army. I just love the way these agricultural references and similes and metaphors are used to describe events in the Bible. The people of Israel are frequently compared to grapes and vines and olives. And the characteristics of those plants and how they produce and how they're harvested are characteristics of how God deals with Israel and what their responses are. And that verse there gets punctuated with this, saith Jehovah, the God of Israel. In other words, this is an emphasis from Isaiah saying, okay, God has said these things, and he writes them out, and then he says, and God said this. So it's like he's pounding this hammer down to pay attention. God is saying this. So shall the righteous be left alone in the world among the kingdoms, saith the Lord God of Israel. And then the text turns to people paying attention to God, and it's so precious. At that day shall a man look to his Maker. You know, when we are subjected to stress beyond our human capacity to fix, beyond our human capacity to understand, people will turn to God. They will turn to God. And a lot of us got saved that way, out of very difficult circumstances. And let's look back at September the 11th of 2001, when the Twin Towers went down in New York. I can remember the people in the Congress. They weren't praying, but they were talking about it. They were singing, God Bless America. And churches around the country started praying. The problem is with this, it doesn't last long. As soon as the situation is fixed and people become prosperous and healthy, it's an individual thing, they push off God. Now they're back to self-sufficiency. But here it's saying that they will look to God, and they did with the destruction of Damascus and the destruction of the northern 10 tribes. Their eye shall have respect on the Holy One of Israel. And what he's saying here is even the Syrians are going to wonder about the God of Israel, the true God. They're going to acknowledge this because they're going to see these calamities coming, and their pagan gods don't do anything, and they know that. But they're seeing Israel and Judah, and they're seeing the blessings that have come to them, which was the whole idea of the purity of the Mosaic Law, to train people and let the world see what the benefits are of adhering to God's law. And this is an example that these Syrians are going to see this. There's no reason to believe that they ever turned to him and became true worshipers, but they realized it. You know, people get stuck in these pagan practices, these pagan religions, and even though they can see the truth, they're stuck in these things and they can't get out. And I've heard plenty of stories of people in Israel that get evangelized and then their families just crash down on them. Even worse in Islam. People that convert in Islam are subject to being killed by their families. So the same situation exists here. They're realizing it, but there's no evidence that they ever came out of that realization with a genuine belief and became true worshipers. When people have the impending armies coming in and they see slaughters with these armies, it sure does change your attitude fast about these pagan idols that don't do anything. Because you start looking at God, you're looking at something far greater than what you can do, and you're thinking, I can't help this. I can't do this. Let's look to God. And they realize right away that with the ones of the pagan gods, this little thing is not going to do anything, this amulet or whatever they're using. And he shall not look to the altars. In other words, they're not even going to look at those false gods because they know they don't do anything. You know, Ahaz was really, really a weak king in the south because when he visited the Assyrians for help against the northern 10 tribes and their alliance with Syria, he really liked what he saw there, so he orders Urijah the priest to construct the same kind of an altar in Samaria, or like in Jerusalem actually, but he subsequently offered sacrifice. He offered sacrifice, and I shouldn't say, I put that in your notes, I'm sorry about that, it should be Jerusalem. Anyway, he set up these altars in these high places, and because Ephraim hath made many altars to sin, altars shall be unto him to sin, which his fingers have made. And this is a reference to idol worship and altars that were made by their own hands, and it just shows that there's no help with any of these false gods. And it's a general reference to the Asherim and the altars of innocence. It points to Baal and the goddess of Ashtoreth. And they worship this Canaanite fertility cult. You see that expressed in Deuteronomy 16:21. And then it ends with either the sun images. The glory of the sun has been a natural object for people to worship. The Babylonians did it. The Syrians did it. The Egyptians may have done it stronger than anybody because one of the leading figures in their religion was Ra, the sun god, and they had a special seat of worshiping him at Heliopolis. God has provided so many warnings, so many. And the idolatry that was up in Ephraim in the north, and the idolatry that came from the pagan nations around them, penetrated very, very deep into Judah, even into the temple. When Josiah, the good king in the south, implemented his reformation, he spoke out against all these things and he forbade them. And both he and God spoke through Ezekiel, speaking through Ezekiel, strenuously denounced these things. No pagan worship, no pagan. People continue to do it anyway. They just continue to do it anyway. And we'll look at this, the rest of this chapter next week. But what I want to conclude with today is, what is God going to deal with them? How is he going to deal? What exactly is he going to do at the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the millennial kingdom here? Because peace is going to come between Israel and Syria, between all these Arab nations, if you will. And each one that we go over, I'm going to show you what God says is going to happen when the kingdom starts. Now, the Messianic kingdom is going to have a status where there's going to be peace between Israel and Damascus, which is part of Assyria, through a conversion of the people. They're going to become believers. And they're going to live with Israel, peace in the kingdom. We're going to see this when we get to Isaiah 19, but I'll read it, a few verses today. In that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall worship with the Assyrians. And in that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt, and with Assyria a blessing in the middle of the earth. For that Jehovah of hosts hath blessed them, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel mine inheritance. Now the Assyrian Empire, once it was formed and conquered, Assyria covered that entire region. So he's talking about them as well. And there's going to be a highway that's going to connect Egypt, Israel, and Assyria in the Messianic kingdom. And then peace is going to be restored between these. The borders are going to be open. There's going to be free trade trafficking up and down this highway. And it's going to be a conversion too. They will convert and become believers. Egypt is also going to undergo this conversion experience. And it's going to be a blessing, an absolute blessing, because they will acquiesce to the God of this universe. They were all former enemies, and they're going to be spiritually and economically unified. So peace is going to come between Israel and Assyria, which is part of Syria, if you will, by means of a conversion. There's going to be an economic, a political, and religious unity, because they're all going to worship the same God, and there's going to be peace between them in the Messianic kingdom. Let us pray.